how is it that there seems to be that there's so many more people walking in power in the kingdom of darkness than those of us that are Christians in the kingdom of God, who have the very Spirit of God living in them on the inside? All right, what's up, everybody? And welcome back to the Tat2d Preacher Podcast. This is episode 42. Hope you are all doing awesome today. And so this is what we're doing. The last episode, I kicked off a bit of a mini series on the subject of the occult. We hit a whole bunch of the different branches that fall under the umbrella of the occult. We looked at, I think, 10 or 11 of them that we see. The reason why I'm doing this and the purpose for this whole little mini-series on the occult is I believe as Christians that there is so much more to experience, so much more to encounter. And the reason why I'm making that statement is when you look around our world today, there's so much darkness, and there's so much the forces of darkness influence so many things, and there's so many avenues, and there's so many compartments, categories to the kingdom of darkness that is real. And I've just heard so many encounters and experiences over the last 1 to 2 years of people that have come out of the occult and sharing their testimonies of the kinds of things that they do. And again, there's so many branches to the occult, but I hear all these experiences and stories, and I'm just like, how is it that there seems to be that there's so many more people walking in power in the kingdom of darkness than those of us that are Christians in the kingdom of God, who have the very Spirit of God living in them on the inside? There's something off there. And so my thesis, my belief, the purpose for this is that I think that as Christians, we should be walking in more power. If God is literally living on the inside, that should mean something. Before I get to a lot of these modern day examples and experiences from different people, and I'm going to be interviewing some people coming up this summer who have who've come out of the occult or who've had experiences in that whole realm. Before we can get to that, because there's some stuff that I think when Christians hear, they're not going to have a radar for it, a paradigm for it. And so I wanted to just give a basic biblical foundation for the occult in the Bible. And so in episode 41, the last episode, we introduced the subject. We defined all the terms of all the different branches under the occult. And so I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. But in this episode, I want to just give a brief look at the occult in the Old Testament. Because again, I think it's so important that we have a biblical basis, a biblical foundation for this subject. Because if we don't understand the biblical roots, understand it from a biblical perspective, then it's going to be easy as we look at modern day stuff to kind of get lost in the weeds. So that's where we're going on this episode, the occult in the Old Testament. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. All right, so to start off, I just want to go over just a couple of the definitions. Not going to go through all of them again. That's in the last episode. But just so we're all on the same page here, so when we're talking about the occult, that word simply means hidden or secret. Hidden or secret knowledge. And it refers to practices and beliefs that involve the supernatural, mystical, and magical things. And occult practices in general, all of the terms under that umbrella, are seen as aligning with false gods and demonic influences. So even though the word occult just means hidden or secret, oftentimes things that are related to the occult are things that are of a demonic nature, demonic influences, things pertaining to the kingdom of darkness. And so I want to just go over two of the terms that we looked at because we're going to be seeing them and our examples today as we go through the Old Testament. And so we defined magic from the Lexham Bible Dictionary, defines this term magic, which is one of the branches under the occult, as ritual manipulation of objects, the use of verbal formulas for the purpose of causing observable change by means of superhuman power. And then the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible defines magic as an attempt to influence or control people or events through supernatural forces. And these forces are called upon by means of ceremonies, the recitation of spells, charms, incantations, and other forms of ritual. And so we see here in these examples, there's this idea of the use of verbal communication to elicit the help of supernatural forces. We see the ability to ritually manipulate literal physical objects. And we're going to be seeing that as well. And then the term witchcraft is defined by the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, is defined by the alleged exercise of magical powers through the gift of supernatural beings other than God and his angels. So again, this whole foundation of the occult is rooted in supernatural demonic entities for the purpose of, supernatural or demonic entities, and not coming from the good side, not coming from God, not coming from the angels, not coming from those in the kingdom of God. So what does the Old Testament have to say about the occult? Now, we would honestly be spending 15,000 hours going through every single instance of the occult in the Old Testament, so we're not going to do that today. But I do want to highlight a few. It's very important to understand from the get-go that God explicitly, over and over and over again, in the Torah, in the wisdom literature, and in the prophets, the whole Old Testament, forbid the practice of anything associated with the occult. So any form of sorcery, witchcraft, magic, necromancy, psychic readings, activities that mediums or spiritists do, all that stuff, all of it, 100% of the time is not condoned by God, and he takes it seriously. And the main passage that kind of highlights this is Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 to 14, where God says this. He says, when you enter the land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire. It's talking about child sacrifice, human sacrifice. It started way back then, where different nations elicit the help of their gods as signs of worship and honor to their gods, as signs of eliciting power from the demonic realm. They would partake in these ceremonies, these rituals, where they would literally offer their children to these demon gods. This is real. So God says, I don't want you to have nothing to do with any of that stuff. One who uses divination, a soothsayer or fortune teller, one who interprets omens or a sorcerer, one who casts a spell or a medium or a spiritist, or one who consults the dead. This is necromancy. For whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord. And because of these detestable things, the Lord your God is going to drive them out before you. You are to be blameless before the Lord your God. For these nations which you are going to dispossess, listen to fortune tellers and to diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do so. And so this is God speaking to Moses to instruct his people before they're going to go into the promised land, the land that he's sworn to give them. He's saying all these nations, they participate in all of this demonic stuff. I want you to have nothing to do with any of it. They are detestable things. So it's important to understand that God is not cool with any of this stuff. And then hundreds of years later, I want to point this out, that they go into the promised land, then there was the period of the kings, and we get to the prophets. Hundreds of years after Moses is writing these words, we see the prophets relaying the same information through God to Israel. And Isaiah 8 talks about how in Isaiah 8, he's warning the people of Israel against consulting mediums and spiritists, urging people to seek God instead. This is hundreds of years later, still relaying the same message. The message hasn't changed. In Ezekiel 13, it condemns false prophets and those who practice magic, highlighting their deception and danger that they pose to the people. Again, hundreds of years later, the message hasn't changed. God is still warning his people against these practices. And God takes this so serious that in Leviticus chapter 20, do you know the penalty for participating in necromancy, in sorcery, in magic, in spiritism? The penalty for these things was death. This is how serious God took it. The death penalty was given to those who were seen to be practicing and partnering with these behaviors. Leviticus 20:27 says this, "Now a man or a woman who is a medium or a spiritist," and again, fill in the blank, "must be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones. They have brought their own deaths upon themselves." And then in Exodus 22:19, Moses also writes, "You shall not allow a sorceress to live." And so we see from the Torah, from Exodus to the prophets, when Israel is taken into captivity and after they were captured and taken into captivity, the message is still the same. Do not participate, do not partake in any of these practices. God is not cool with that. And the reason why I'm starting this episode off by saying that is because when you look at our culture and you look at certain segments of the occult, typically involving the New Age movement, they have a lot of terminology, a lot of practice that on the surface actually looks good. See, there's two kind of categories, and again, we'll get into this in future episodes, but there was like black magic and like white magic. There's the good, and then there's the bad. Now, but the deception is they're both bad. But even in the kingdom of darkness, as a means to deceive people, they still try to categorize as good and bad when it's all bad. And so a lot of people get caught up in the occult thinking that they're doing good, thinking that, oh, I'm not going to be a part of all the darkness and all the like Satanism and all that stuff. I just want to be a part of this thinking and this teaching that's just about good vibes, good energy, manifesting good things. And you get sucked in under the white magic category, but it's all bad. God doesn't condone any of it. And so it's important to see that. It doesn't matter how the verbiage has changed over the course of history. When you are participating in these kinds of things, it is always seen as pagan practice in the eyes of God, and he takes it serious. No good. All right, so there is no part of the occult that is good. So here are a few stories, occurrences that we see in the Old Testament, and there's so many. Like there's honestly, I was preparing for this, like there are so many examples, so many verses that speak to this. But obviously, for the sake of time and for the sake of familiarity, I'm going to just hit on three stories, three examples that we see the occult being practiced, played out in the Old Testament. And so the first one is a very famous example, and it's dealing with the whole exodus from Egypt. Remember, God comes to Moses and he tells him in the desert, hey Moses, my people have been suffering for 400 years now. It's time that you go rescue them. I've heard their cry. Their cries have reached to me. It's time to get them out of there. And so he sends Moses there, and there's this whole dialogue between Moses and God. And Moses is freaked out. He's scared. He's like, God, like, why is Pharaoh going to listen to me? How is he just going to let them go? I'm a nobody. I'm supposed to show up to the most powerful dude in the land, one who thinks he's literally God on the earth. And I'm just supposed to say, Yahweh says, you got to let these people go. Like, why is he going to believe me? And so as a means of confirmation, God gives Moses some supernatural power, some supernatural abilities to show Pharaoh as a means of showing legitimacy in what Moses is asking Pharaoh to do, which is to let Israel go. God gives Moses a staff. And so him and Aaron, they go to Pharaoh. Moses got his staff. And so one of these miracles, one of these acts of power is he goes to Pharaoh, and in this process of him trying to show Pharaoh who he is, Moses throws down his staff, and that staff turns into a snake. And so I don't know about you, but like, man, if some dude comes up to me, throws down a big stick, and that stick literally turns into a snake, I'm gonna listen to that guy. That's something that shouldn't be happening. There's something going on there. But what was Pharaoh's response? He's like, okay, I'm gonna bring in my boys. And so he calls all of the sorcerers, magicians, the occultists that were under his rule, all of those who knew the secret arts, the secret dark arts. And he gets them, brings them before Moses, and says, Moses, I can do the same. These guys can do the same things. And interesting, the sorcerers, Pharaoh's boys, throw their staffs down, and they also turn into snakes. And so it's easy to look at it from Moses' perspective. Okay, well, God, Yahweh gave Moses this ability. However that happened, Bible doesn't say. Just God said, when you do this, the staff will turn into a snake, and it did. It's coming from God. And so, but look at these other sorcerers, these other magicians. This wasn't delusion. It says in Exodus 7:11, it says, Pharaoh's sorcerers through their own secret arts, turn their staffs into snakes. And so these sorcerers, these magicians, these occultists that were in Egypt under Pharaoh, whatever they were doing, they literally using, as we defined at the beginning, the ritual manipulation of objects. They took a stick, and they, through their arts, whatever they said, whatever they did, their sticks also became snakes, and it wasn't the power of God. It's an example of this ritual manipulation of matter, of objects, and I'm sure they added verbal incantations and phrases, and as they would do this kind of stuff, it is real. And so they turned their sticks into snakes. And then, because Pharaoh's guys did that, it kind of lost that shock value that Moses was going for. And so Pharaoh's like, no, not let them go. My guys can do that. How powerful is your God if my boys can do what your God can do? And so this is when we get into the plagues, the 10 plagues, or as one scholar calls it, the 10 wonders that happened. And remember the first two of the plagues. The first one was God says, put your staff in the water, and the Nile River is going to turn to blood. And so Moses does that. The whole Nile and all the water in the land of Egypt turns into blood. Well, Pharaoh sees this happening. He's like, okay, well, I'm gonna bring my boys back. So he brings his sorcerers back, and they do the same thing. They have water, and they turn that water into blood using their dark arts. And so Pharaoh's like, not impressed. And then the second plague was the plague of the frogs, where then God brings, like, causes like the whole land to be covered with frogs. And so Pharaoh's like, okay, I'm gonna get my boys again. And they do the same thing through their dark arts. I don't know how they do this. All the frogs came up from the Nile River when God told Moses to declare that. And Pharaoh's sorcerers did the same thing. Somehow there was a way to determine that they're calling up frogs as well. But they did that using their dark arts. They were creating animals, and it wasn't the power of God. And so again, it's this ritual manipulation of objects. It was this demonic creating thing, causing frogs to show up. Like, think about that for a second. Like, that's crazy. And it's coming from the kingdom of darkness. They were tapping into this, dark energy, this dark power through their incantations and spells, through their, eliciting help from supernatural entities that aren't God or his angels, which was the definition of witchcraft that I began this episode with. They're eliciting power from demonic entities that aren't God or his angels. It's real. And of course, you know how the story ends. Then the third plague and so on, the Pharaoh's boys couldn't compete with God. Eventually, God was like, okay, this is enough. I'm shutting this whole thing down, and you're going to see my power. But the point is that in Egypt, there were practicing sorcerers, magicians, occultists, who were able to do some pretty crazy things. This is just one example from the biblical record, but we don't know all of the day-to-day stuff. I mean, obviously, Pharaoh's having these guys on his staff, on his team, because they can do some stuff. And so imagine taking that demonic power and using it for purposes of war, purposes of expanding your kingdom and territory. I mean, you can see how this stuff can play out. This is real power. And we see that in the story of the Exodus. So that's the first example, a very famous example, a very powerful demonstration of the occult in the Bible. And the second is in the period of the kings, we see this cycle happening over and over again in Israel, where there was a good king that God would raise up, and then eventually there'd be wicked kings that would come up, and then another wicked king, and then this son was wicked, and their son took the throne, and they were wicked. And so there was this period of rebellion, which is what ultimately led to God sending Israel into captivity, because God gave Israel hundreds of years to repent, to turn back to him, to stop, doing insanely demonic things, and they just never listened. And so in 2 Kings 17 here, this is just one of the examples of that cycle when they were caught in this succession of evil king, one after another. And so it was King Hoshea came to power. They were being led by this king into complete, utter wickedness. And so I'm going to read these 10 verses, and we're going to see the kinds of things that this wasn't Egypt. This is not the pagan nations. This is God's people now. This is the people of God who are supposed to be following him, being obedient to him, that are doing what we're about to read. And so here we go. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 7. It says, "Now this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord, their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods. They followed the customs of the nations whom the Lord had driven out from the sons of Israel, and in the customs of the kings of Israel which they had introduced. And the sons of Israel did things secretly against the Lord their God, which were not right. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their towns. Now, high places, for those of you who don't know, in that ancient world and their culture, they believed that, the gods lived and resided on top of mountains. And you'll always see this theme woven throughout the scriptures, the high places. And this is where they would build their altars. This is where oftentimes they would have their ceremonies and their rituals and their demonic stuff happening on top of mountains at the high places, because that's where they believed they would connect, they would encounter the gods that they worship. And so they had built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city, and they set up for themselves memorial stones and asherim on every high hill, under every green tree. It's the same with trees. It's a whole other study in and of itself. Trees are often associated with worship and ceremony and ritual. Verse 11, and there they burned incense on all the high places, as the nations did that the Lord had taken into exile before them, and they did evil things provoking the Lord. So they're doing all the stuff that the pagan nations were doing. Like God said, remember in Deuteronomy 18, don't do these things. Well, they're doing them. And here's what they did. They served idols, concerning which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this thing. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn back from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with the law which I commanded your fathers and which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers who did not believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant which he made with their fathers and his warnings which he gave them, and they followed idols and became empty and followed the nations that surrounded them, which the Lord had commanded them not to do as they did. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves cast metal images, 2 calves, and they made an Asherah, and they worshipped all the heavenly lights and served Baal. So they're creating these idols, statues to worship, and they began to worship the heavenly lights, the heavenly host, stars in the sky. Now, oftentimes, when the Bible talks about the heavenly stars, it's metaphor for actual divine beings. They were worshiping divine beings, and they served Baal, which was like the head honcho, one of the main false gods of that day. And then verse 17, then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. So now they're getting involved in child sacrifices. So they're creating all of these high places all over in every town. And they're having these ceremonies, these rituals that the pagans were doing, sacrificing their own kids. This is the people of God here participating in these satanic, ritualistic practices, sacrificing their kids to false gods. And it says, then they practiced divination and interpreting omens, and gave themselves over to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him. So here we see Israel, the people of God, under the leadership of a wicked king who began to lead God's people into these deplorable and detestable practices, sacrificing their kids to false gods, setting up idols, setting up high places where they would have all of these ceremonies and rituals happening, worshiping false gods. He was leading them to do this, where they would be practicing divination, interpreting omens, witchcraft, necromancy, all of these evil practices. This is what the people of God were doing. And this is just one example of that cycle. And this was happening over and over again for literally hundreds of years. These practices were happening in Israel, in the midst of God's people. And so it's important that we see it's not just the pagan nations, but in the history of God's people, these occultic practices were like the norm for generations. I mean, when you are involving yourself in child sacrifice, you don't sacrifice your kids. You don't participate in these practices if they're not real. Like you just don't do that. And so one of the things that we have to really wrap our minds around, because oftentimes with our modern day, especially in the church, we read all this stuff and it's like, oh, this is just ancient stuff. It's not really happening today. And it's tough to really, wrap our minds and really understand what's going on. But we have to understand that what they were doing was actually eliciting demonic entities. Like they were actually worshiping divine beings. And when you look at other parts of the Bible, they were the fallen sons of God. They were actual divine beings that fell from heaven and were eliciting worship for themselves. They're not just worshiping these fake, idols and little statues thinking, oh, that's cute. No, they actually were worshiping demonic entities, and they would do all of these things to elicit their response, to elicit help. And then when you get into the whole demons thing, when you're participating in necromancy, when you're participating in sorcery, when you're trying to elicit power, they're actually receiving it from these demonic entities. So it's real. Like we have to get that it's real. It wasn't just this routine that they went through, and then at the end, it was just kind of wishful thinking. No, it was actual, legit results. God doesn't forbid something. God doesn't give the death penalty for something that's not real. Makes no sense. And so we have to see that even in the midst of Israel, for generation after generation after generation after generation, they were participating in this occultic wickedness, which is what then led to God judging them and sending them into captivity. That's the second example. And then the third one is another famous one. And it's the story of King Saul and the witch of Endor. And for this one, rather than just read, it's 1 Samuel 28, verses 7 to 20. Rather than just read that, I want to read the words of an ancient historian named Josephus. He's probably one of the most prolific ancient secular historians that ever existed. And he, in a lot of his writings and his work, he goes through and he provides a lot of commentary on biblical stories. And so in one of his writings, he actually writes about this particular story. And so I just want to read his perspective on it, just to kind of give it a bit of a different flavor and a different feel. And so here's Josephus, here's his words as he's talking about the story of King Saul and the witch of Endor. He says, "Now Saul, the king of the Hebrews, had cast out of the country the fortune tellers and the necromancers, and all such exercised the like arts. And all such as exercised the like arts, excepting the prophets. But when he heard that the Philistines were already come and had pitched their camp near the city Shunem, situate in the plain, he made haste to oppose them with his forces. And when he was come to a certain mountain called Gilboa, he pitched his camp over against the enemy. But when he saw that the enemy's army, he was greatly troubled, because it appeared to him to be numerous and superior to his own. And so he inquired of God by the prophets concerning the battle, that he might know beforehand what would be the event of it. And when God did not answer, so Saul, they're about to go to war, he sees the enemy, and they're like crazy outnumbered. And so he's freaking out. And so he tries to ask God, inquire of God, okay, God, what do we do here? What's going to happen? Is it going to go well with us? And God's not responding to him. Saul was under still greater dread, and his courage fell, foreseeing, as was reasonable to suppose, that mischief would befall him. Now God was not there to assist him. Yet did he bid his servants to inquire out for him some woman that was a necromancer, who called up the souls of the dead, so he might know whether his affairs would succeed up in his mind. For this sort of necromantic women that bring up the souls of the dead do by them foretell future events to such as desire them. And one of his servants told him that there was such a woman in the city of Endor, but was known to nobody in the camp. Hereupon Saul put off his royal apparel, took 2 of those of his servants with him, whom he knew to be most faithful to him, and came to Endor to the woman, and entreated her to act the part of a fortune teller, and to bring up such a soul to him as he should name to her. So he goes to this woman, who's apparently his servants. There's word about this one particular witch, this one particular woman who can bring up souls from the dead, who can do the very things that Saul had tried to cleanse the land of. But she somehow remained, slipped through the cracks. And so somehow they found out about her. And so Saul's going to this woman to get her to talk to a dead person for him. But when the woman opposed his motion and said she did not despise the king, who had banished this sort of fortune tellers, and that he did not do well to himself, when she had done him no harm to endeavor or to lay a snare for her, and to discover that she exercised a forbidden art, in order to procure her to be punished, he swore that nobody should know what she did, and that he would not tell anyone else what she foretold, but that she should incur no danger. So he's trying to tell this woman, don't worry, you're not going to get in trouble. I'm not going to tell anybody. I'm the king. It's all good. As soon as he induced her by this oath to fear no harm, he bade her to bring up the soul of Samuel. And she, not knowing who Samuel was, called him out of Hades. And when he appeared, and the woman saw one that was venerable and of divine form, she was in disorder. And being astonished at the sight, she said, Art not thou King Saul? For Samuel had informed her who he was. When had asked her whence her disorder arose, she said that she saw a certain person ascend, who is in his form was like to a god. And when he bid her to tell him what he resembled, and what habit he appeared, and of what age he was, she told him he was an old man already, and of a glorious personage. And he had on a sacerdotal mantle. And so the king discovered by these signs that he was Samuel, and he fell upon the ground and saluted and worshipped him. And when the soul of Samuel asked him why he had disturbed him and caused him to be brought up, he lamented the necessity he was under, for he said that his enemies pressed heavily upon him. Then he was in distress what to do in his present circumstances, that he was forsaken of God and could obtain no prediction of what was coming, neither by prophets nor by dreams, and that these were the reasons why I have recourse to thee, who always tookest care of me. But Samuel, seeing that the end of Saul's life was come, said, It is in vain for thee to desire to learn of me anything further, when God hath forsaken thee. And so here's this example, this story, where Saul goes to this woman, the witch at Endor, who was clearly somehow was known as someone who can call up dead spirits. And it's interesting, this story, it's interesting because not only is this a real thing, but she actually called up Samuel. And so it's funny when you're reading some of the commentaries in this as they're trying to really process this, because when this happens in the modern day, when you talk about going to a fortune teller or going to a psychic, and they say, yes, I have a word from beyond. I'm speaking with your grandma, and your grandma wants me to tell you that she's okay and that everything's going to be fine. It's often assumed that they're not speaking to the grandma. They're speaking to a demonic entity that's masquerading itself, that's pretending to be the grandma. But in this story, this witch actually calls up Samuel. And when you read the biblical account and the way he's described, it's like, no, this dude, it's not someone pretending to be Samuel. It's actually Samuel. And so you see the witch's, she was like surprised when she saw him, and she knew there's something different about this guy. Something's different. And then she put two and two together. And so you see common scholars and commentaries trying to get around this idea. Well, maybe it wasn't actually Samuel, because they know modern day examples of this is just people talking to demonic entities. In this case, it was. And so I think it's one of those stories that just kind of blow your mind. But the point of this story is that this woman could consult the other side, like necromancy, this practice of what spiritists and mediums do. A lot of this stuff, yes, is fake, it's hoax, it's illusion, but there are those who actually have the ability to pierce through the veil to the other side. Because this is why God gives the death penalty to this. If it was all fake, you're not going to give the death penalty to something that's not real. And so this was happening in Israel. In Israel, there was a witch living in Israel who could do this, and we see this happening all throughout the scripture. This practice where the dead was being consulted. They are able to pierce the veil, communicate with the other side, and receive information about what's happened, information about what's to come, which is also fascinating, because a lot of times people, when we think of the demonic entities, it's like, well, they don't know the future. Only God knows the future. A lot of stories, it's like they're predicting the future. This is what being a diviner does. Divination is part of that process, is getting told what's to come, what's the future result of this battle, of this war, of this country, of this person, whatever. And so clearly there is some supernatural understanding where they can in fact know the future. And again, I'll get into all of this in future episodes and really diving down deep into my thoughts and opinions on it. But I just wanted to share this example, just to put this out there, that it's real. This is not fake. It's not a practice that's just, a hoax, but it's got ancient roots, the practice of consulting the dead. And so to conclude this episode, there's so much more examples that we could get into, but I want to lay this out there that all throughout the Old Testament, number one, God is opposed to this stuff, takes it seriously, doesn't condone it. This is the penalty of death for those that practice it. And all throughout the Old Testament, there's examples of these dark arts, these secret arts, these occultic practices being played out in the pagan nations, as well as actually in Israel, the people of God. And so this stuff is real. And there's a biblical precedent, a biblical foundation for it. And so when we look at modern day examples, modern day things associated with it, if we have this understanding of the biblical use of these practices, then it can help us discern what people are experiencing and encountering in today's time, in today's culture. And so God's against it, and it's happened all throughout the Old Testament. And so I hope that these stories now maybe pop out to you in a bit of a different way. I'm hoping that, at least in a very small way, that your eyes, your perspective is being opened, being stretched just a little bit to see these examples playing out, to see that ritual manipulation of matter, of objects, is real, that contacting, piercing the veil, piercing through the other side, getting out of this dimension into the next is possible. It's happened, and it's still happening. I hope that idea is being stretched in your mind, because there's so much stuff that's out there today that I just think the average Christian just would not have the capacity to understand or even process. And so I hope that these biblical stories, examples from this episode and ones in upcoming episodes are just going to help give you that perspective to at least be able to engage in conversation and to talk about some of the crazy things that people are experiencing today. Well, that's it for episode 42. Hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave any comments, questions in the comment section if you're watching this on YouTube. Would love to know your thoughts, your opinions. And if you haven't yet, you can feel free to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. All the links to all my platforms are in the show notes. So feel free to subscribe and follow. And have an awesome rest of your day or evening. And we'll see you all in the next episode. Much love and God bless.